Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. Tonight is a presentation of the Delta Alpha Pi Honor Society, made possible with help from Student Disability Services. I'd like to thank David Jai and our captioning and interpreting services who are assisting us tonight. As for me, my name is Sarah Gaddis, and I am the secretary of the Omicron chapter of Delta Alpha Pi. Here at UT, I am a communication studies major, but I have always been involved in mental health care in some way throughout my life. I personally know how painful it is to struggle with an untreated mental illness, so I am very enthusiastic about education and outreach about our community's mental health resources. That's why I am extremely excited to introduce tonight's speaker. Jimmy Hill's training includes a Master of Arts in Counseling. He is a licensed professional counselor and a certified sex addiction therapist. He founded Trailhead Treatment Center here in Knoxville, which specializes in working with folks who identify as male and the range of issues that primarily affect them. He is passionate about working with men because he deeply understands what it is like to be plagued by the mental and physical issues that affect them. Jimmy grew up with a father who is narcissistic, sex addicted, and had an extremely hyperactive form of ADHD. His mother was highly codependent and placed Jimmy in charge of her emotions beginning very early in his childhood. As the result of his parents' mental health challenges, Jimmy did not understand his own feelings or trust his intuition, and he developed very low self-esteem. It only took one bachelor's degree in psychology, one master's degree in counseling, 5 years of being a therapist, 3 children, a failing marriage, and almost reaching burnout for Jimmy to go to therapy himself and seek treatment for his own ADHD. He finally realized he could not heal himself solely by helping others. His passion is for working with men who, like him, struggle with complex relational trauma. In men, complex trauma can manifest in a number of ways, including everything from depression and rage to severe addiction and self-harming behaviors, all of which wreak havoc upon their relationships. Jimmy's specific training includes treating men who struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors, compulsive pornography use, and the subsequent relational problems that follow. Jimmy resides in Knoxville with his wife and 3 children and enjoys spending as much time as possible with the 4 of them, while also learning how to develop close, vulnerable relationships with the other men in his life. He's learning how to be a better dad and partner while being a business owner and therapist. I met Jimmy a few years ago when I worked at a mental health clinic here in Knoxville, and we became fast buddies. So now I'll let the man himself speak. Jimmy Hill, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you inviting me to do this, and I'm going to start sharing my screen here too as we move into this here. There we go. Yeah, so I want to also thank the Delta Alpha Pi Honor Society and the Student Disability Services for presenting for having me tonight, and I want to thank Sarah for inviting me to do this. I am super excited about men's mental health. As she was reading that back, I haven't read that intro since I wrote it a month or so ago, and I'm like thinking now, man, that was an overshare. So anyway, I hope from that intro you could see that I've struggled with my own issues. I'm no stranger to mental illness myself, and also being very avoidant of therapy. So it, like she said, it just took a while for me to really get in and to try out a few different therapists to find the one that was a good fit for me. So, yeah, so I founded in 2019, I founded Trailhead Treatment Center. And if you'd asked me, like, whenever I started being a therapist 7 years ago, that I would have, specialized in working with men, I would have probably been very scared and overwhelmed. Because I felt a lot of deep insecurities when it came to working with men because of my own childhood issues and those kinds of things. But here I am after doing a lot of work, my own therapy, and I just really love working with guys. I want them to feel the confidence and the clarity and the perspective that I have been able to achieve over the past year or so. So at Trailhead, we actually treat men that range really from 18 to 60 years old. It's not a hard cutoff at 60, but that's, the issues start to really kind of change. And so we stick with that 18 to 60-year-old range. As Sarah alluded to, I work with men who have emotional intimacy deficits, meaning they're kind of scared of sharing their emotions, scared of sharing themselves with others. A lot of them have complex trauma, especially the ones that struggle with a lot of very entrenched compulsive behaviors. And then my colleagues at Trailhead also specialize in working with sexual minority men and the issues that they may face, and then college-age men. So that's a little bit about us. And so tonight, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the root of men's mental illness or mental health issues. And so the reason why I want to talk about the root is because I feel like, we could talk about, anxiety, depression, we can kind of go through the different things that, men might face kind of on a surface level, but I want to talk about where this stuff really begins from a societal perspective. And see, as we go through this tonight, just kind of reflect on yourself. Take some time to see how these things have shown up in your life, because again, everything's on a spectrum and it affects everybody differently, the things we're going to talk about tonight. And so some people, it's, they grew up in households that were very caring and warm and affectionate and attuned to their kids. And other people grew up in very disconnected homes, violent homes, and those kinds of things. So everything's on a spectrum. We're going to talk about common mental health problems men experience, reasons men often avoid therapy, like myself, like Sarah was saying. It took me, 6 years as a therapist to really get into therapy myself, which is just absolutely, that's amazing. So we're going to talk about tips for finding the right therapist, the one that is a good fit for you, and signs that it may be time to find a therapist. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some mental health resources that you guys can use to maybe locate a therapist that's a good fit for you. So let's start with the root of men's mental health issues. And we're going to talk about this guy, Terrance Real, a few times throughout tonight's presentation. I really like him because he speaks about this common issue that men face, which is psychological patriarchy. That's how he coined it. So obviously, maybe most of you are familiar with the term patriarchy, and you understand that this is a system in place that gives men power and it reduces women's power in the structures that are in play in our society. And obviously, there's much more to that. And so tonight we're going to kind of talk about the psychological piece of that and how it really is devastating to men's mental health. And so what Terrance Real talks about is that when kids are born, they are emotionally halved, meaning when female children are born, or those that have been identified as female children are born, they are usually allowed to express a lot of their emotions, a pretty good range of emotions, from hurt, sadness, loneliness, fear, and of course, there's always exceptions to these things. So tonight we're going to be kind of oversimplifying some of these things, but there's always exceptions. But what happens is they're systematically discouraged from really developing their assertive selves, or what we would call their voice. And then male children are encouraged to develop their assertive selves, and they're systematically pushed away from exercising their emotional expressivity. And what happens is that, again, in different households, different things occur, but in general, boys are, they hear phrases like, boys don't cry, and don't be afraid, and don't be a sissy, and dry it up, and you're being too sensitive. And what happens is they're taught to kind of stuff those emotions. They're not welcome. So half of us growing up in kind of patriarchal homes, which is, and nobody is not affected by this. If you grow up in this society, in Western society, you are affected by these concepts here in some shape, form, or fashion. Maybe not at the house. Maybe your parents are super expressive and they let you be however you want to be. But if you go to school, if you go to public school or whatever, you're going to be around peers that are going to, give these messages to you, essentially. And so what this does is that by 5 years old, boys are really losing their ability, or they're not gaining the skill of identifying and articulating their emotions. And when they hear these messages, what it's telling them is like, feelings are something only girls can do, especially if they have sisters or something. They can see that their sisters are treated a bit differently than they are from an emotional perspective. And then what that tells the boy is that, well, feelings are weak, and that's not something I can do, but that's something girls can do, then women are weak, right? So again, we're already starting to see that power structure kind of play out, that women are weak, men are strong, and this is what it takes to be strong. This is what it takes to be stoic or masculine. And then it also teaches them that they can't freely express themselves. And it teaches us that parts of us are just simply not welcome. And I like this quote from Terry, because I think it really summarizes what we're talking about here. And he says, let me get a drink. I've got cotton mouth for some reason. What he says is recent research tells us that boys from all walks of life evidence a clear, measurable decrease in expressiveness and connection by the ages of 3, 4, and 5. By the time most boys hit kindergarten, they show significant drops in their dependency on others. They show significant drops in their willingness to express strong emotion or openly demonstrate their dependency on others. Before our sons learn how to read, they have read the Stoic code of masculinity. And really, if you could wrap up psychological patriarchy in one sentence, what it does is it teaches women that they don't know, and teaches men that they don't have to care. And the way this works is that if a woman can't express herself, if she can't talk about an injustice that's happening to her, then she's having to reduce what she feels on the inside. She can't trust her own internal experience. She becomes more of a caretaker. Caretaker role is really valued and pushed on girls in patriarchal households. And all this is in charge. All this does is it's in service to the man's ego, because a woman is taught, or a girl is taught, that she cannot make the boy feel bad about his insecurities and those kinds of things. And then it teaches men not to care, because you can't really care if you haven't been allowed to feel your feelings, and you don't really know what you feel. And so what that does is it actually decreases your ability to empathize with other people, especially your close relationships. And if you can't empathize and you can't really feel how somebody else feels, then it's really limiting your ability to connect with the person and achieve like healthy communication. So all of a sudden, we've got men that are really disconnected and women that are very disempowered in these kinds of households. And this is, it wreaks havoc on everybody's emotional health, but it definitely wreaks havoc on men's mental health, because even though they have this power that they didn't earn, they have this privilege that they didn't necessarily earn, all of a sudden they're kind of put in these positions of power. They look like they're said that they know more, and they're given some respect that just wasn't really, they didn't earn. And it supports traditional masculine norms, and toxic masculinity is what psychological patriarchy supports. So what is toxic masculinity? Well, a couple of researchers give some different definitions. One set of researchers suggest that toxic masculinity is characterized by a drive to dominate and by endorsement of misogynistic and homophobic views. Another set of researchers suggests that it is characterized by the enforcement of rigid gender roles that also involves the need to aggressively compete with others and dominate others. Now, as we step into this next set of slides, we're going to be talking about the traditional male role norms that a group of researchers found that are predominant in Western contemporary society. And there's 11 of them that they identified. And so if I want to invite you guys to kind of engage in some self-reflection. If you have a notepad or something around you, take down some notes as we talk about this. Take down some of these norms that may have affected you, or that you may actually subscribe to, unknowingly or knowingly. So do that. If you're a man, think about how it's affected you, and if you identify as a woman, think about maybe the men in your life, and how you may have seen these norms play out with them, or maybe you've not seen these norms a lot with the men in your life. And I would say that you're lucky if you have not. So here are the traditional male role norms. The first one is winning. And now here's the thing is, if you are a man, you are and you're out of touch with your emotions, then you don't really know who you are, because knowing your emotions and being able to identify your emotions, what you're feeling, what you really like, or what you really don't like, if you don't really know what that is, which I didn't for so long, then you really have to compare yourself to others. And what this does is psychological patriarchy and these toxic masculine norms. What happens is they actually put you in either a one-up position to the other men in your life, or a one-down position to the other men in your life. You're constantly comparing yourself. Am I better than him? Am I worse than him? There's no just being you. So winning is a big, it plays a significant role in so many lives of men. And what it is it's a drive to win, be competitive, and have a fear of losing. That's what that norm entails. Emotional control. This is restricting emotionality and the discussion of feelings. And if you are not talking about your feelings, you're probably not engaging in a lot of self-reflection. And if you're not engaging in self-reflection, then you're there's this kind of shallow component to relationships. Then there's risk taking. This involves a drive to take physical and interpersonal risks, such as being in physical danger. And especially men that are under 26, 27 years old, because 26, 27 is about the time the brain starts to really finalize its development of the prefrontal cortex. And this is the impulse regulation part of your brain. It helps you make good decisions. And so prior to that age, it's really easy for high school age boys and college age men to make some pretty bad decisions from a risk-taking perspective. And then there's the norm violence, which just essentially is what it says. It's justifying violent behavior, especially involving violence between oneself and others. The next one, power over women. This involves a masculine dominance over women physically, emotionally, and socially. So this is the one that really subjects women, and you see this show up. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a few minutes, but if you just take a look at the mass shootings that took place in Atlanta, a week or so ago, that killed all those Asian American women, and that guy really subscribed to this norm here, power over women. Actually subscribe to a lot of these. And as you're going through, we're all affected by these things. And those people that engage in these terrorist activities and these terrorist behaviors, they're the extreme form of this. But again, it's all on a spectrum. All right. For some of us, it just shows up as depression. And for others, it shows up as like being a terrorist. So the next one, dominance, is a need for power and control. Playboy. This suggests a desire to have multiple sex partners and engage in casual sex. So being prolifically sexual is something that's seen as kind of honorable or something to achieve, or in a patriarchal society. And then it's going to be big in college, right? Because college is, from a biological perspective, for the biggest age range, 18 to 22, 23 years old. That's the time that your sexual drive is really, maybe not at its peak, but it is really high, and you're learning to express yourself sexually, which is extremely normal and natural. But for boys and men that are raised in psychological patriarchal households, where these norms are taught, all of a sudden, sexual expression turns into sexual conquest and using and discarding and objectifying women and others. And then self-reliance. This is mandating self-reliance and restricting help-seeking behaviors. So it's not cool for men to reach out and ask for help. It's not cool for them to open up, right? According to these traditional male role norms. And so this really limits men from, reaching out and getting help, professional help, because they don't want to talk about what's going on inside of them. Primacy of work, prioritizing career and work-related endeavors over personal relationships, hobbies, and self-care. The next one, heterosexual self-presentation. This includes sexist and homophobic norms. And essentially what it boils down to is the fear of being perceived as gay. And my colleague reminds me a lot as a gay man, he reminds me that, as for me being a straight man, that as we grow in intimacy and grow in connection and friendship, things boil up inside of me because of this norm here that I was taught, like, that's not cool. That's not what you do. And so he talks about it as gay panic, right? So he sees gay panic coming up at me. And so it's good. He calls it out of me and I reflect on it and I do some therapy around it so that I can be more comfortable with who I am and express myself, not feeling like I have to fear being straight or gay. I can just be myself. But gay men are also not, this happens to them as well, and through something called internalized homophobia. And if you don't know what internalized homophobia is, please go Google it. What it means is that there's a shame around being perceived as gay, and everything that may come along with that, stereotypes that may come along with that. And so they are not immune to this particular norm either. So it's destructive for them as well. And then pursuit of status, which mandates men should pursue prestigious social positions. And again, one up, one down position. They're always comparing themselves. And there's no better place to compare yourself than work, because you have, or school, because you have grades and you can look at them. And anytime you get in a group of guys, notice what happens. The first thing they usually ask, if they don't know one another, is, what's your major in y'all's case? Or what do you do? And what that does is that creates a pecking order within the group. Who's up, who's down, who's the smartest, who's going to make the most money, who isn't. And so that's what's happening there. Now, I hope that, as you reflect on those things, you can kind of see how these things have affected you, either through your parents and through your peers, or even in your own self. And really, as I reflect on these, I can really identify how I've held each one of these beliefs, at some point in my life, given my history with my parents and how my father was. These are the norms he subscribed to as well. He was a quote unquote man's man and hyper masculine, and carried a lot of shame, tried to put that shame onto me. So he wanted me to be hyper masculine and be kind of violent and ready to fight and, those kinds of things. And then we talk about, what I spoke about earlier. In the most extreme cases, it really looks like violence, male violence against women. All right, so some common mental health problems men experience or may experience. And what I did here is I took a sampling of the research that was still related to these traditional masculine norms, so you can kind of see how they play out actually in the research. Now, the first one, which actually was really big, so the combination of emotional control and self-reliance. Some researchers found that these two norms here created men. It made it where men had just an unwillingness to talk about their internal feelings and experiences. The next one, this is really important for you guys, especially if you're men and you're in college. Emotional control and self-reliance norms were the strongest negative predictor of college men seeking help for suicidal thoughts. So if you've had suicidal thoughts and you have not sought help for that, it may be because these norms are kind of, you've been taught these things. And I just want to encourage you to seek some help. It's okay to talk, to get some help from a counselor, or call on the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. those kinds of things. But this certainly affects men, and it can lead to them um, dying by suicide. So the other one is that emotional control and self-reliance norms are the strongest predictor of men's mental health problems across several studies. So these two, emotional control and self-reliance, are killers. So if you feel that or struggle with that, please reach out for some help. Another combination of those masculine norms was playboy, self-reliance, and risk-taking. And what they found was this was correlated to increased psychological stress among men. And yeah, so if you think about it, I mean, these three norms right here play out in college so frequently. So again, trying to be prolific sexually and express yourself, and only relying internally on yourself, not opening up to other people, and then taking a lot of risks. And when that happens, people get hurt, typically women. And so that's something to reflect on. Another one is heterosexual self-presentation, and men who have sex with men who conform to this particular norm were less likely to undergo HIV testing if there was a threat of an exposure, because again, the shame and wanting to present differently. And so again, it can be very harmful to not only them, but to others that they're around. And then problematic pornography usage was correlated with men conforming to the norm of power over women. And even in heteronormative, what we call vanilla pornography, it really still generally depicts the woman, where the woman is focused on the man's sexual pleasure. So again, you see this even in the basic of porn. This is kind of what's going on there. So again, that norm is really showing up in so many places. All right. So let's see here. Before we actually move on, I just want to say that even like, there's some guys that feel generally more kind of, they lean towards their masculine parts a bit more, just kind of naturally. And then there's some men that lean towards their more sensitive, emotional feeling parts more naturally. And I consider myself more of a sensitive male. I was a sensitive boy growing up, and having a father who really subscribed to these norms always felt like I was kind of like, if I had to do it or if I had to act like him, it always felt like me putting on like this costume or something that was like oversized. And I always felt like people could see through it. Like I'm not really like this masculine man. And then what that made me feel like was, it always made me feel like I was different, or something was kind of wrong with me because I wasn't like him, or I wasn't like my uncles or something like that. And so it always made me feel, it contributed to my low self-esteem, essentially. And so the ability to step into being a feminist man and working on these norms inside of me and doing my own work and exploring how my privilege is affecting others and how these norms are affecting others in my life really has reduced so much stress, and it's brought a sense of like calm and clarity to my life. And I also have ADHD, and acting more quote unquote masculine and subscribing to these norms really exacerbated my ADHD, because if I'm carrying a lot of shame because I'm not like the other men, then I'm in my head a lot and I can't focus on what's going on around me. Then I also have ADHD, which also, really limits my focus on things that I need to really be focusing on. And so it's exacerbating all those symptoms. So it's having a tremendous effect on me. And now I'm just feeling a lot of calm, a lot of decrease in stress, and just an increase in general perspective. So, all right, now going back to Terry Real for a minute. This is something I want to talk about because it's a little more colloquial, a little more clinical, like something that you could really use or think about in your own life. But he coined this term called covert depression. And essentially what he says is that women tend to internalize their distress. So the classic symptoms of depression, like, fatigue or feelings of hopelessness, or feelings of guilt and loss of interest in things. That's internalized stress and distress, and that's what you see in the DSM, the manual that we use to actually diagnose people. And then men, though, tend to actually externalize their stress and their depression. And so what happens is that clinicians usually miss the diagnosis of depression in males 70% of the time, according to some national studies. So what this is like 1 out of 3 men present with like this kind of classic depression, whereas the majority of men are actually presenting with this covert depression. And it doesn't look necessarily like a loss of energy. It actually can sometimes look like a lot of energy. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But while depressed women typically feel disempowered, depressed men generally feel disconnected. Now, 3 indicators or types of symptoms in men that show up with covert depression. First, they usually seek to escape via like substances, drugs and alcohol, things of that nature, working excessively or focusing on maybe school excessively, and then seeking sexual experiences outside of their romantic relationship. Then they begin to really isolate from their close, meaningful relationships, their loved ones and their friendships. And then finally, they typically experience a lot of increases in irritability, rage, emotional outbursts, passive aggression, road rage, just general lashing out. And if you think back to your father, if your father was home or you had any experience with him at all, if you think about him and think and reflect on if he used substances, if he kind of isolated himself from others, if he lashed out a lot, if he had an explosive temper, that's covert depression more than likely. Now, just because you drink or just because you use marijuana or something like that, that does not mean you're necessarily depressed. So I do not want to say that. But I guess what I would ask you to do is if you are kind of considering, do I have a problem? Maybe do I not have a problem? Is just stop using for like, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, and just see how difficult it is for you. And if it's not difficult, well, then you might be fine. And there may be no issue with that particular substance. But if you're really struggling to stop and you really have this propensity to use kind of compulsively, then that might be an indicator that there is a problem there. Now, here's the thing is, I believe in the therapists at Trailhead Treatment Center, our kind of philosophy of treatment really is that if therapists do not really understand these concepts about men, it's going to be more difficult for them to really work effectively with men. And therapists sometimes, and myself included, especially in the past before I understood these things, we may even unknowingly collude with these societal systems that are in place which uphold these traditional masculine norms and psychological patriarchy. Especially, now this is a big one, and I kind of want to give you a pointer just because I work with sexually compulsive behaviors and sexual addiction and those kinds of things. There's a lot of therapists out there that say they work with sexual addiction, and it predominantly shows up in evangelical communities. So if you grew up in an evangelical community, there are more people that are coming from fundamentalist religious communities that think that they have a sexual addiction when they're really just confusing their sexual drive with it being high and compulsive, when it's just really kind of a natural, normal sexual drive, because they've been told that their sex drive is bad. They've been told that sexual, masturbation is bad, or those kinds of things are sinful. And so here's the thing is that if you go to a specific counselor who also subscribes to these belief systems, then what's going to happen is it's going to reinforce that belief that your sex drive is bad or something's wrong with you. So it's important to recognize these norms and how they're affecting men, and not to collude with them so as to uphold some kind of traditional view of masculinity, because that only serves to make the person feel worse in general. All right, reasons men often avoid therapy. I want to be cognizant of the time here, so we got about 25 minutes left, it looks like. So, and we'll save some time at the end for question and answer. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about, feel free to send them to the moderator, to Sarah, and she'll gather those up and she'll alert me if they start kind of rolling in, and we may end a little early to answer some questions. So reasons men potentially avoid therapy. So again, I know this like the back of my hand. I mean, like I'm a therapist, and it took me about 6 years before I really went to therapy. So therapy is the very nature of therapy sessions is really at odds with how most men communicate. And so, based on everything we just talked about, I mean, what are men asked to do when they come into a therapy session? They're asked to talk about themselves. They're asked to talk about their feelings and talk about their experiences, which is at odds with everything that we just spoke about. So it can feel very problematic for a man to do this, and it can feel very kind of exposing. And but here's the thing: is believe it or not, men actually have the same ability as women to express their emotions. They just lack the skill. And I've seen this over and over again with the men that I work with. It takes about a year, a lot of times, especially with some of the guys in their 40s and 50s, because they lived this way for so long. So it can take a year, 2 years sometimes for men to really get in touch with their emotions, feel really comfortable with their emotions. But once they do, man, it just changes everything. Their relationships improve, their work improves, their ability to parent improves, the friendships improve. So everything improves when you learn to talk about your feelings. The next one especially is not for men. It's for both. It's for men and women, or non-binary folks. So they've tried therapy before and they didn't like the therapist. I hear this one a lot. And so here's the thing: is if you had a physical issue, a physical illness, you go to your doctor, you don't feel seen or heard by your doctor, you don't really like your doctor, it's not a good fit. You don't just not go back to the doctor. You find a new doctor. You look for a new doctor. Same way with therapists. Not every therapist is going to be a good fit, and not every time you go to therapy, the first therapist you come to is not necessarily going to be a good fit. It actually took me 3 therapists to find the one that was a good fit for me. Now I'm a little extra picky because I am a therapist, so I know exactly what I'm looking for. But yeah, so just be patient with yourself. It can be a tedious process at times, but you're worth it. The investment in your life is worth it. So please consider that. Another reason men are avoiding therapy is because a lot of times they're being made to go to therapy by either their parents or a partner, a romantic partner, because their parents are fed up with them, or maybe their compulsive alcohol use, or maybe their partner is fed up with them cheating on them or something like that. So they're pushing them into therapy, and that's how a lot of guys show up in my office: is their partner like demands that they go to therapy. And so here's the thing: is that if you're made to go to therapy, motivations and energy is probably already low, but you only get as much out of therapy as you put into therapy. So what I would encourage you to do if you are a man is just to consider therapy with some curiosity. Go into that first, second, third session just with some curiosity, and at least give it 2 sessions before you know whether or not it's a good fit for you. And then finally, being vulnerable can just be scary. Living under these masculine norms you start to carry a lot of shame. And shame are the things that we don't want to talk about. We don't want people to see. We don't want people to know about. And so it can be extremely scary to like reveal yourself to somebody else. And what I would say to that is that reveal as you're comfortable to do so. Start out slowly and maybe reveal a little bit something about yourself to your therapist and see how that goes. And if it goes well, then you can reveal a little bit more. But be assured that the license on my wall prohibits me from talking about your problems to other people. And number one, I don't want to talk about your problems with other people. I want to honor your confidentiality and honor your woundedness and the things in your story that you tell. And number two, this is my source of income. So I don't want to lose that just because I want to talk about the things that you're going through. So this can be a very safe space and a very courageous space for you to do the work that you need to do and reveal those things about yourself that maybe you haven't told anybody before. So, all right, tips for finding the right therapist. And let's see what time we are at. Yeah, okay. So we got about 5 minutes. All right. So the big thing here is the therapist you're looking at are the clinically trained and licensed. So life coaches, pastors, friends, and family cannot provide clinical counseling or clinical therapy. So while all of these people can be a great support system, if you are struggling with some of these things that we talked about before, you probably need to see a clinically trained professional. So that would be my strongest recommendation to you. Again, there's nothing wrong with any of these people providing advice or listening. That's actually a really good thing. We want good, strong support systems, but sometimes we need that specific relationship that is professional and they have some good clinical training and some techniques and solutions. Do they have consistent availability? So right now during the pandemic, this is a little hard to find just because everybody's seeking therapy right now and everybody's booked up. But the more frequent sessions that you can have early on in the process, the better the foundation is going to be. But if you can only go like once a month, then, you know, it's probably not going to be as effective. So yeah. All right. Another really important thing, especially for people in minority populations, is is a therapist culturally competent? And here's the issue is that it really is the therapist. It's their job to be curious about your life. That's their job. And yes, you will have to explain how you feel and offer your unique perspective about the things that you are going through. But it's not your job as a client to constantly have to educate your therapist on, you know, the specific issues of your specific minority community. So please be aware of that. If your therapist is like really curious and asking questions that are not really specific to what's going on specifically to you, then it might be time to find another therapist. Or you might want to talk to your therapist about that and ask what's going on there, which then really leads us to the next one, which is, does the therapist specialize in your presenting problem? So specialty is really important. Finding a culturally competent therapist is really important. And if you have a very specific issue, like for instance, if you are struggling with like compulsive sexual behavior or something, that's going to be something you might want to seek somebody out that has some specific training, because it does carry some very specific things or set of symptoms that if we're not trained in it, we might miss, and they're kind of critical. Resolving those specific symptoms are critical to finding relief. And then finally, don't limit yourself to Knoxville or the city you live in. Telehealth provides opportunities to meet with a therapist all across the state. That's one of the big things that happened with the pandemic, is that it got all of us out of our comfort zone as a therapist, and we started having to use telehealth. And so I think by this point we are all pretty comfortable with it. And so that's so those are some tips for finding a therapist. Oh, and then the other one is, but maybe you found a therapist that meets the above criteria. How do you feel in session? So here's some questions to ask yourself. Now, we're going to wrap up here because we want to save a little bit of time for Q&A. But you can find, Sarah will give you the link to where you can find these slides. And there's a mental health resource at the end. Let me switch over to that too. There we go. Mental health resources there for specifically minority populations. And then psychology. So UTK Counseling Center is a fantastic resource. Obviously, you guys, it's right there local to you. And then Psychology Today is a great resource as well. It's probably the biggest listing of therapists that you can find. But then there are some other resources there that hone in on some more specific communities that you'll find a culturally competent therapist that can really provide the help that you need. So, all right, I will stop sharing there, and I think, let's see here. Yeah, okay.
All right, yeah,
Sarah?
we got a couple of questions. Let me
Perfect.
pull them up for you. All right, the first one we've got: in discussing confidentiality and its limits with men, do you find the exceptions, including intent to harm themselves or others, knowledge of child abuse and elder abuse, to turn men away from opening up to sharing with you?
That's a great question. It's kind of complex, really, because A lot of times men, because those things are so shameful, if they are engaging in violent behavior towards others, they don't really talk about those things. And those men also usually aren't seeking therapy because if they're engaging in violent behavior, more than likely they're struggling with a personality disorder like narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. And if somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder, they are not seeking therapy. And the only time they come to therapy is when their partner makes them come to therapy. And so, and there's really two types of narcissists. There's the sadistic kind of like grandiose narcissist, and then there's the vulnerable narcissist. We don't really get the sadistic grandiose narcissist in therapy. Those are politicians, CEOs, and just really, really violent people. They're the ones that are like in prison and stuff, right? We know some of those politicians. All right. But the vulnerable ones, those are the ones that are usually having affairs on their spouse. They're the ones that are being abusive towards their children, things of that nature, and they get drugged into therapy. And so in those cases, I have reported. I actually reported with the guy in the therapy session before who struggled with vulnerable narcissism with his wife because of some child abuse that was going on. So yeah, it happens. And he still comes back because he knows I care for him and I care for his well-being. And we've established that rapport, but he knows I have to do what I have to do. And at the end of the day, I think it built actually respect more than it took, he was afraid of coming back. So I hope that answers the question.
Or yeah, no, it sounds like a great answer to me. This one, I think, this next question kind of is a segue. It's a great segue. Do you work with men experiencing pedophilic disorders?
Yes. So that is also one that I work with because actually I assess on certain days of the week or a couple of times a month. I actually am trained by the Tennessee Board of Sex Offending Providers or Sexual Offender Provider. I can't even say it right now. Anyway, I treat sex offenders. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, yeah, that does actually show up. I mostly evaluate those guys because most of them are headed to jail or they recently got out, and I evaluate them. But yes, I do work with some guys that have pedophilic interests. And yeah, was there more to that question that I missed?
No, it was just a simple question.
Yeah.
And our final question that we've got here is how important is the therapist's school of thought, i.e., psychodynamic, behaviorism, humanism, etc., for the patient? Does it generally make a huge difference in care?
Hmm. That is a great question. All these are great questions. Um, so I would say my belief about this is that, and actually what the research shows is that the relationship built with the client is the most important piece. And then the modality and the techniques and interventions that are used are secondary. Um, Now, that's what the research suggests. I also have a personal treatment philosophy of specialization, and I think it's really important that therapists do specialize and have a primary modality that they really use and subscribe to because I believe that makes them more effective because they feel more confident in their abilities and they know more about what they're doing rather than dabbling kind of here and there and that kind of thing. Because what happens when you dabble is you become a jack of all trades and a master of none, and so that limits your effectiveness. And then also one of the things that I was going to point out that I forgot to mention that kind of goes along with this is that when you do search for a therapist, you may find that a lot of them will say they specialize in like 40 different things or they treat 40 different things. And so I always approach that with caution. And I very rarely refer to a therapist that does that because I just don't think that that is really number one fully accurate. So I would say approach those there. There's some therapists out there that are just brilliant and geniuses, and that's great, right? Like they have very high intelligence, and they can keep all that stuff in there. I'm not one of those. I have to know something specifically and work from that model because that helps me become more effective and helps reduce the time a person has to be in therapy. So I would say relationship first, modality definitely second, and then knowing a specific modality is super important. So
Thank you for that. Awesome. If I may indulge myself and ask you one of my own questions, really quick. I've seen a great deal of writing, think pieces, studies on how to compliment young girls about their intellect and their courage and things like that. Anything that's not about their appearance. Do you have any similar advice for young boys?
Yeah, this is a great, oh, it's a good question. And it's funny because I'm gonna, I go to TikTok University, so let me say that. I'll just be honest, I love TikTok. Well, number one is because I have ADHD. And number two, it just gives you like this sampling of so many people and cultures and thoughts and whatnot. And it gives it to you in these little short, sweet, like digestible, videos. And so I just saw a video the other day, and it really, again, being a feminist man, it really, I didn't even think about this, but it speaks to this. So I'm going to quote this woman that I actually learned this from, and she says the difference between flirting and sexual harassment is empathy. And if you cannot feel empathy for someone, then you don't see them really as a person. You don't understand how they feel. But if you can understand how somebody might feel, should you ask a specific question to them, or should you give them a specific compliment based on either their appearance or their intellect or whatever the case is? If you have empathy, then more than likely, it's probably going to come from a good place and it may be accepted well. But if you don't, then it probably is going to lead to someone feeling very uncomfortable, specifically the female. And so, yeah, I would just say empathy. And that's, again, why it's so important to learn how to process your emotions, because empathy really starts with you. You got to have empathy for yourself. If you can't have empathy for yourself, you can't really have empathy for others. And it's our parents' job to mirror that empathy back to us at young ages. That's how we build that skill. And to kind of maybe say just a couple more things about that.
Please,
There's a difference between compassion and empathy and sympathy. All right, because we kind of throw these words around sort of interchangeably. And the way I want to kind of define that is sympathy is sort of when you pity somebody. You're sort of kind of look down. You're like in this higher elevation. You see yourself sort of this higher elevation than them. You sort of look down and you sort of pity them. You have no interest in helping, no interest in understanding. It's just sort of like, right? Almost in disgust a little bit. Then there's compassion, and compassion is really a good feeling, because even if you can't quite understand how somebody feels, compassion is your ability to try to understand that, to intellectually, like, what would lead somebody, or why would they get in this position, or what happened to cause this specific thing to happen, right? And so maybe you haven't had that specific thing happen to you, but compassion allows you to just really be intentional and take some time and really think about it. And then empathy is when you actually have compassion and you're dropping down into your body and you're feeling what that other person might feel. Like, I've been there before. I've really felt that. I know how that is. And when we're in that place, sometimes it's hard to not over relate to them. So you don't want to decrease, like if somebody's like sharing something with you, you may not want to like say, oh yeah, I had that experience too. Let me tell you, you may want to say like, wow, yes, I can feel that, like that. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And that feels tough, right? That's empathy. So I hope that makes some sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jimmy. And thank you very much
Absolutely.
for giving us your time tonight.
Yeah,
This
my
has been
pleasure.
amazing. Really enjoyed it. Very, very informational. In closing, I'd like to highlight the fact that the University of Tennessee has a student counseling center right here on campus. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, if I can. Yeah. And the Student Counseling Center offers crisis services as well. If you need to speak to a counselor right now, please do call 865-974-HELP. You can also text But please feel free to visit their website and get more information on teletherapy. They also offer medication management services, which can sometimes be even harder to find. So, in closing, thank you all for coming to the webinar this evening. Thank you, Jimmy, again for spending time with us. Thank you to Student Disability Services and the UT Counseling Center for everything they do for our vols. Thanks, guys.